The November wind cut across the Wyoming plains like a blade, carrying with it the promise of an early winter that would test even the hardiest souls. In the fading light of dusk, Reid guided his weathered pickup truck down the gravel road that led to his family's century-old ranch, the headlights cutting through the gathering darkness as they illuminated the familiar landmarks of home. At 34, Marcus had inherited more than just land and livestock from his grandfather. He'd inherited the weight of legacy, the burden of keeping alive something that had survived droughts, economic downturns, and the slow exodus of young people from rural communities. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Broken Arrow Ranch sprawled across 1,500 acres of some of the most beautiful and unforgiving country in the American West, where the mountains met the plains in a symphony of geological magnificence that could take your breath away or break your spirit, depending on the season. The barn loomed ahead, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood in the twilight. Marcus parked beside the structure that had sheltered 3 generations of Reid livestock, its massive doors standing slightly ajar despite his memory of securing them that morning. The wind could be tricky in these parts, he reasoned, capable of working latches loose with persistent pressure. But something felt different tonight, a subtle disturbance in the natural order that made the hair on the back of his neck stand at attention. Marcus had learned to trust his instincts during his years working oil rigs in North Dakota, where a moment's inattention could mean the difference between going home to family and never going home at all. Those instincts had kept him alive in industrial settings where danger lurked in every valve and connection, and they served him equally well in the isolated vastness of ranch country, where help was often hours away, and self-reliance wasn't just a virtue but a necessity for survival. The crunch of his boots on frost-hardened ground seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness as he approached the barn. November in Wyoming was a month of transitions, when autumn's last gasps gave way to winter's relentless advance, and the temperature could drop 30 degrees between sunset and midnight. Tonight carried the metallic scent of snow in the air, though the weatherman had predicted clear skies through the weekend. Marcus had long ago learned that the land itself was a more reliable forecaster than any meteorologist sitting in a climate-controlled studio hundreds of miles away. As he reached for the barn door, a sound stopped him cold. It wasn't the familiar rustling of hay, or the occasional lowing of cattle seeking shelter. This was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in his carefully ordered world. A soft whimper, barely audible above the wind, followed by what sounded almost like a lullaby being hummed in a voice strained with exhaustion, and something that might have been desperation. Marcus pulled the heavy door wider, its hinges protesting with a groan that echoed through the cavernous interior. The smell hit him first, not unpleasant but foreign to his barn, the scent of wood smoke and unwashed bodies, and something wild that made his pulse quicken. His hand found the switch for the overhead lights, fluorescent tubes that flickered to life with reluctant cooperation, casting harsh shadows across stacked bales of hay and the various implements of ranch life. What he saw in the corner nearest the feed bins defied everything he thought he knew about the natural order of his world. A young woman, perhaps 26 or 27, sat with her back against a hay bale, her arms wrapped protectively around 3 small children who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. The children were identical in that eerie way that marked them as triplets, their faces smudged with dirt and tear tracks, their clothes wrinkled and travel-worn. But it wasn't the unexpected family that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. Curled around the small group like a living fortress was a timber wolf, its massive frame positioned between the family and the barn door, its intelligent yellow eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that spoke of wild intelligence and protective instinct. The animal was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, easily weighing 120 pounds, its thick coat a mixture of gray and black and white that seemed to shift and flow in the uncertain light. This wasn't a dog, wasn't some domesticated creature that had wandered in seeking shelter. This was a predator, an apex predator, lying peacefully beside 3 small children, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The woman's eyes snapped open the moment the lights came on, and Marcus saw terror flash across her features before being quickly replaced by a fierce determination that reminded him of a mother bird protecting her nest. She was beautiful in the way that hardship could sometimes make people beautiful, her features sharpened by stress and exhaustion, but still retaining an underlying strength that spoke of reserves yet untapped. Her long brown hair was braided loosely down her back, and her clothes, while clean, showed the wear of too many washings and too much use. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and something that might have been desperation. "We're not stealing anything, we just needed somewhere warm for the night. We'll be gone before dawn, I promise." The triplets stirred at the sound of voices, their small faces turning toward Marcus with expressions that broke his heart. They should have been afraid of a stranger, should have hidden behind their mother's skirts or cried for protection. Instead they looked at him with the weary acceptance of children who had learned too young that the world was an uncertain place and that safety was a luxury they couldn't always afford. One of the children, a little girl with her mother's brown hair and eyes that seemed far too old for her face, reached out a small hand to touch the wolf's fur. The animal's massive head turned toward her touch, and Marcus held his breath, waiting for the inevitable tragedy that would unfold when wild instinct overcame whatever strange magic had kept the creature peaceful thus far. Instead, the wolf's tail gave a gentle thump against the hay-strewn floor, and the child smiled for the first time since Marcus had entered the barn. "Luna protects us," the little girl said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "She found us when the bad men were coming, and she led us here. She said this was a safe place." Marcus blinked, certain he had misheard. "She said." The woman, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of pride and apprehension, managed a tired smile. My daughter has quite an imagination. She's always talking to animals as if they could understand her." "I'm sorry we're trespassing on your property, Mr. Reid," Marcus supplied automatically, his mind still struggling to process the scene before him. "Marcus Reid. This is my family's ranch." He paused, studying the unlikely group. "How long have you been here?" "Since this afternoon," the woman admitted, pulling the children closer. "We were walking along the highway when the weather started turning, and your wolf found us. She led us here, looked right at us like she was trying to tell us something, then brought us to your barn." The children were so tired, and it was getting so cold. Marcus's rational mind insisted that wolves didn't lead lost families to safety, didn't lie peacefully beside human children, didn't somehow communicate across species barriers. But the evidence was right in front of him, impossible to deny, despite its violation of everything he thought he knew about wildlife behavior. The wolf Luna watched him with those intelligent yellow eyes, and Marcus had the uncanny sensation that she was evaluating him, making some kind of judgment about his character and intentions. "What are your names?" he asked, directing the question to the woman while keeping a wary eye on her unusual protector. "I'm Sarah Colton," she replied, her chin lifting slightly as if preparing for judgment. "These are my children, Emma, Ethan, and Elena." She gestured to each triplet in turn, and Marcus noted how each child raised a small hand in greeting, their manners intact, despite their obvious circumstances. "And Luna?" Marcus asked, nodding toward the wolf. Sarah's expression grew complicated, a mixture of wonder and disbelief crossing her features. "She's not ours, exactly. We'd never seen her before today, but when we needed help most, she appeared." And the children, they took to her immediately, like they'd known her their whole lives. Emma, the little girl who had spoken earlier, looked up at Marcus with eyes that seemed to hold secrets far beyond her years. "Luna says you're going to help us. She says you're one of the good ones, and that your heart has room for more love, even if you don't know it yet." A chill that had nothing to do with the November weather ran down Marcus's spine. Children said strange things, he told himself. They had active imaginations and a tendency to anthropomorphize animals. But there was something in Emma's tone, a certainty that spoke of knowledge rather than wishful thinking, that made him wonder if there were forces at work beyond his understanding. The wind outside picked up, rattling the barn doors and reminding Marcus of the dropping temperature and the promise of snow that hung heavy in the air. Whatever strange circumstances had brought this family and their lupine guardian to his barn, they couldn't stay here overnight. The barn wasn't heated, and the children were already shivering, despite being pressed close together for warmth. "You can't stay out here," Marcus said, making a decision that surprised him, even as the words left his mouth. "It's going to get down into the teens tonight, maybe lower. The house has heat and hot water and beds." Sarah's eyes widened with surprise, and something that might have been hope before caution reasserted itself. "That's very kind, but we can't impose. We're strangers, and we have nothing to offer in return." "You're not strangers," Marcus found himself saying, though he couldn't explain where the certainty came from. "You're people who need help, and this is Wyoming. We don't leave people to freeze." Luna raised her massive head at the sound of his voice, and for a moment, Marcus felt as if she were looking directly into his soul, measuring him against some standard known only to herself. Then, to his amazement, the wolf stood gracefully and moved toward him, her movements fluid and purposeful. She stopped just close enough for him to smell the wild scent of her fur, close enough to see the intelligence gleaming in those yellow eyes, and then she did something that would haunt Marcus's dreams for years to come. The timber wolf tilted back her magnificent head and released a sound that was part howl and part song, but so soft, so gentle, that it seemed more like a lullaby than the wild call that had echoed across these plains for millennia. It was a sound of acceptance, of approval, of something that transcended the normal boundaries between species and spoke to connections that ran deeper than civilization, deeper than the rational mind could comprehend. The triplets smiled as if Luna's soft howl had confirmed something they had been waiting to hear. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears that could have been relief or wonder, or simple exhaustion, finally finding a safe harbor. And Marcus, who had spent his adult life dealing with the practical realities of ranch life and business decisions, and the straightforward challenges of wresting a living from unforgiving land, felt something shift deep inside his chest, a loosening of walls he hadn't even realized he'd built. "She approves," Emma said simply, as if this explained everything that needed explaining. Marcus looked at the child, at her two siblings who nodded their agreement, at their mother who seemed caught between disbelief and desperate hope, and at the magnificent wild creature who had somehow appointed herself their guardian. The rational part of his mind catalogued all the reasons this was a terrible idea, all the ways that bringing strangers into his home could complicate his carefully ordered life. But a deeper part of him, a part that remembered his grandfather's stories about the mystical connection between the land and those who truly belonged to it, whispered that some things were meant to be, regardless of logic or convenience. "Well then, Wisman," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt, "I guess that settles it. Let's get you all up to the house before this weather gets any worse." The journey from the barn to the ranch house was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his 34 years. Sarah carried Elena, the smallest of the triplets, while Emma and Ethan walked between their mother and Marcus, their small hands gripping his larger ones with a trust that both humbled and terrified him. Luna padded silently alongside them, her massive form moving like a shadow given substance, her presence both protective and otherworldly. The ranch house sat on a slight rise overlooking the valley, its log construction and wide front porch speaking to an era when homes were built to last generations rather than decades. Marcus's grandfather had added the wraparound porch in the 1960s, and his father had modernized the interior plumbing and electrical systems in the 1990s. Now it was Marcus's responsibility to maintain the legacy, to keep the old place alive and functional for whatever came next. As they climbed the front steps, Marcus found himself seeing his home through the eyes of his unexpected guests, the porch swing where he sometimes sat in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains, the collection of antique farm implements that served as decoration but had once been essential tools for survival, the heavy oak door with its beveled glass panel that had witnessed 3 generations of Reids coming home from their various adventures and misadventures. "It's beautiful," Sarah murmured, shifting Elena's weight as she took in the view from the porch. Even in the darkness, the majesty of the landscape was evident, the rolling hills and distant mountains forming a backdrop that spoke of space and freedom, and the kind of peace that could only be found far from the complications of modern life. "My great-grandfather built it in 1923, Marcus said, fishing his keys from his jacket pocket. "He chose this spot because you can see for miles in every direction. Back then, that kind of visibility could mean the difference between life and death." Luna paused at the threshold, her wild instincts clearly warring with whatever force had led her to shepherd this family to safety. Marcus held his breath, wondering if inviting a timber wolf into his home would prove to be the last decision he ever made. But Emma reached down to stroke the animal's thick fur, whispering something too soft for Marcus to hear, and Luna stepped delicately across the threshold, as if she had been entering houses her entire life. The interior of the ranch house reflected Marcus's practical nature and his respect for family history. The furniture was comfortable rather than fashionable, built to withstand the wear and tear of ranch life while maintaining the dignity appropriate to a family home. Photographs lined the mantelpiece above the stone fireplace, 3 generations of Reid family portraits documenting the changing faces of those who had called this place home. Sarah's gaze was drawn to a wedding photograph from the 1940s, Marcus's grandparents on their wedding day, young and hopeful and ready to take on the world together. "They look happy," she observed, her voice wistful in a way that spoke of dreams deferred or lost. "They were," Marcus confirmed, following her gaze to the photograph. Married 63 years before Grandpa passed, Grandma followed him 6 months later. She used to say she couldn't figure out how to be herself without him. The triplets had gravitated toward the fireplace, their small bodies drawn to the promise of warmth like flowers turning toward sunlight. Luna settled herself on the hearthrug with the fluid grace of a creature born to command whatever space she occupied, her yellow eyes surveying the room as if cataloging potential threats and escape routes. I should get a fire started, Marcus said, moving toward the wood box his grandfather had built into the wall beside the fireplace. It'll take the chill off while the heat kicks in. As he arranged kindling and logs with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been building fires since childhood, Marcus found himself acutely aware of the domestic scene unfolding around him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah had settled onto the couch with Elena curled against her side while Emma and Ethan explored the room with the careful curiosity of children who had learned to appreciate shelter when they found it. The sight stirred something deep in Marcus's chest, a longing he had pushed aside years ago when life had taught him that some dreams were too dangerous to nurture. The fire caught quickly, sending dancing shadows across the log walls and filling the room with the comforting scent of burning pine. Luna raised her magnificent head to watch the flames, and Marcus could have sworn he saw approval in those intelligent eyes, as if the wolf recognized something primal and right about the gathering of this unlikely pack around the ancient comfort of fire. "When did you last eat?" Marcus asked, turning from the fireplace to find Sarah watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Yesterday morning," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "We had granola bars, but they didn't last long when you're sharing them 4 ways. Marcus felt anger rise in his chest, not at Sarah or her children, but at whatever circumstances had left a mother and 3 small children wandering the Wyoming plains without adequate food or shelter. "I'll make something," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Kitchen's well stocked and I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage something filling." "You don't have to," Sarah began, but Marcus cut her off with a gesture. "Yeah, I do," he said simply. "My grandfather would roll over in his grave if I let guests go hungry under his roof." The kitchen, like the rest of the house, bore the marks of 3 generations of use. The appliances were modern enough to be functional but old enough to have character, and the large wooden table in the center of the room had been the site of countless family meals and important conversations. Marcus pulled ingredients from the refrigerator and pantry with automatic efficiency, his hands moving through the familiar motions of preparing a simple meal while his mind struggled to process the surreal turn his evening had taken. Sarah appeared in the doorway, having settled the children by the fire under Luna's watchful protection. "Can I help?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty, as if she wasn't sure whether her offer would be welcome. "Can you handle scrambled eggs while I work on the bacon?" Marcus asked, nodding toward the carton of eggs on the counter. "Figure simple food is probably best for kids who haven't eaten much lately." They worked together in comfortable silence, the only sounds the sizzle of bacon in the cast-iron skillet and the soft murmur of the children's voices from the living room. Marcus found himself stealing glances at Sarah as she whisked eggs with practiced efficiency, noting the way she held herself with careful control as if she had learned not to take up too much space in the world. "You're good with them," Sarah said suddenly, nodding toward the living room where the children's voices could be heard in animated conversation with Luna, who seemed to be participating in the discussion through strategic positioning and the occasional soft whine. "I don't know much about kids," Marcus admitted, flipping bacon strips with more attention than the task required. "Never had any of my own." "Were you married?" The question slipped out before Sarah could stop herself, and Marcus saw her face flush with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." "No, it's okay," Marcus said, though he could feel the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied thoughts of the path his life hadn't taken. "Came close once. Her name was Jennifer and she had big plans for both of us. Plans that didn't include spending her life on a remote ranch in Wyoming. She left. She tried to get me to leave with her. Said there was a whole world out there waiting for us and all I had to do was let go of the past and embrace the future." Marcus stirred the eggs Sarah had poured into another pan, the simple motion helping to steady his voice. "Trouble was, this ranch isn't my past, it's my present and my future and my responsibility. Some things are worth holding onto even when they cost you other things you thought you wanted." Sarah nodded, understanding evident in her expression. "Some people don't understand that kind of commitment. They think love should be easy, that if something requires sacrifice it can't be worth having." "What about you?" Marcus asked, then immediately regretted the question when he saw Sarah's face close off, her walls rising with practiced speed. "I learned that love and commitment aren't always the same thing," she said quietly. "And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from someone who claims to love you." The weight of unspoken history hung between them, and Marcus sensed that there were depths to Sarah's story that would take time and trust to explore. He focused on the practical task of finishing their meal, giving her space to rebuild whatever defenses his question had inadvertently breached. "Food's ready," he called toward the living room, and the sound of small feet running across hardwood floors filled the house with the kind of life it hadn't experienced in years. The triplets attacked their plates with the single-minded intensity of children who had learned not to take food for granted, while Luna accepted pieces of bacon from each child with the dignity of a queen receiving tribute. Sarah ate more slowly, her gaze moving constantly between her children and Marcus, as if she were still trying to process the sudden change in their circumstances. "This is the best bacon I've ever had," Ethan announced, his small face serious with the importance of his declaration. "It's from our own pigs," Marcus explained, surprising himself with how natural it felt to use the word "our" in reference to the ranch. "Raised them ourselves, so we know exactly what they ate and how they were treated." "You killed them yourself?" Emma asked, her question matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "I did," Marcus confirmed, watching her face for signs of distress. "That's part of ranch life. We take care of our animals while they're alive, and when it's time, we make sure they don't suffer." Emma nodded solemnly. "Luna says that's the right way. She says some humans forget that taking a life is supposed to mean something." Marcus nearly choked on his coffee. The child's matter-of-fact reference to the wolf's supposed opinions was becoming less charming and more unsettling with each repetition. He glanced at Sarah, who was watching her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. "Emma has always been sensitive to animals," Sarah explained, though her tone suggested that even she was finding her daughter's apparent communication with Luna to be beyond the normal range of childhood imagination. "Sensitive how?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. "She knows when animals are hurt or scared, even when they're hiding it," Sarah said. "And they seem to trust her in ways that surprise even veterinarians to think it was just coincidence, but Luna's different," Marcus finished, understanding flickering in his mind. Sarah nodded. "Luna's different. The way she found us, the way she's protecting us, the way she seems to understand everything we say. Emma talks to her like they're having actual conversations, and sometimes I swear the wolf is responding." As if summoned by their discussion, Luna raised her magnificent head and fixed Marcus with those intelligent yellow eyes. For a moment he felt as if she were looking directly into his soul, evaluating him against standards he couldn't comprehend. Then, to his amazement, the wolf rose gracefully from her position by the fire and padded across the room to where he sat. She stopped beside his chair, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her thick coat, close enough to see the wild wisdom in her eyes. Then, with deliberate care, she lowered her massive head and rested it on his knee, her weight both comfortable and profound. "She likes you," Elena said simply, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the house. "She says you have a good heart, but it's been sleeping for too long." Marcus's hand moved almost without conscious thought to rest on Luna's head, his fingers burying themselves in the thick fur at the base of her ears. The wolf's eyes drifted closed, and a sound that was almost like a purr rumbled in her chest, though Marcus was pretty sure wolves didn't purr. "How long has she been with you?" he asked, his voice strangely thick. "Since this morning," Sarah replied. "We were walking along Highway 287 trying to figure out where we were going to spend the night when she just appeared at the edge of the road. She looked at us for the longest time, then started walking in this direction. When we didn't follow fast enough, she came back and, well, it sounds crazy, but she herded us, like we were sheep and she was a sheepdog." "Timber wolves don't herd people," Marcus said, though even as the words left his mouth he realized how pointless it was to argue with the evidence sitting right in front of him. "No," Sarah agreed, "they don't, but Luna isn't exactly behaving like a normal timber wolf, is she?" As if to emphasize the point, Luna shifted her position so that her massive body was pressed against Marcus's legs, her presence both comforting and surreal. He could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing, could sense the wild power contained within her deceptively relaxed form, and he found himself wondering what strange confluence of circumstances had brought them all together. "Where were you heading?" Marcus asked, directing the question to Sarah while continuing to stroke Luna's thick fur. "When you were walking along the highway," Sarah's expression grew guarded again, the walls rising to protect whatever secret she carried. "Anywhere but where we came from," she said quietly. "We needed to get away, and direction mattered less than distance. Running from something, someone," she corrected, her voice barely above a whisper. My ex-husband, he doesn't believe in letting go of things he considers his property. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus felt anger stir in his chest again, hot and protective and entirely unexpected in its intensity. He'd known Sarah Colton for less than 4 hours, but the thought of someone threatening her or her children triggered an instinct he hadn't realized he possessed. He won't find you here, Marcus said, the certainty in his voice surprising him. This ranch is off the beaten path, and people around here mind their own business. You don't understand, Sarah said, fear creeping into her voice. He has resources, connections. He's not the kind of man who gives up easily. Neither am I, Marcus replied, and Luna raised her head to look at him, those intelligent eyes seeming to approve of something she heard in his tone. The conversation was interrupted by Elena's yawn, a wide, jaw-cracking expression of exhaustion that reminded Marcus that it was well past normal bedtime for children so young. The other triplets quickly followed suit, their adrenaline finally giving way to the accumulated fatigue of their ordeal. They need sleep, Sarah said, gathering Elena into her arms. We can make do on the couch, or if you have some blankets, the floor would be fine. There are 3 bedrooms upstairs, Marcus said, rising from his chair despite Luna's obvious reluctance to give up her comfortable position. Take your pick. The beds are made up, and there are extra blankets in the We can't, Sarah began, but Marcus cut her off. You can, and you will, he said firmly. Those kids need real beds and a good night's sleep, and so do you. We'll figure out everything else in the morning. Sarah looked as if she wanted to argue, but exhaustion was written in every line of her body, and the children were already swaying on their feet. Just for tonight, she said finally. We'll be gone in the morning. Marcus nodded, though something deep inside him rebelled against the idea of their departure. Just for tonight, he agreed, knowing even as he spoke the words that he was lying. As the small family made their way upstairs, Luna rose from her position by Marcus's chair and padded after them, her massive form moving with the fluid grace of a creature perfectly adapted to her environment. At the foot of the stairs, she paused and looked back at Marcus, her yellow eyes holding a message he couldn't quite decipher. Then she tilted back her magnificent head and released another of those impossibly soft howls, a sound that seemed to carry promises and possibilities and something that might have been hope. The sound echoed through the old house like a blessing, like a prayer, like a bridge between the world as it was and the world as it might become. Marcus stood alone in his kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of an impromptu meal and the lingering warmth of unexpected company, and wondered what forces had conspired to bring this strange family and their otherworldly guardian to his door. Outside, the November wind continued its restless dance across the Wyoming plains, but inside the old ranch house, something new was taking root, something that would change everything Marcus thought he knew about his carefully ordered life. The last thing he heard before drifting off to sleep in his grandfather's old recliner was the soft sound of Luna's paws on the hardwood floor above, the timber wolf taking up her post as guardian of the small family who had somehow chosen his ranch as their sanctuary. And in that sound Marcus heard the echo of his grandfather's voice, telling stories of the mystical connection between the land and those who truly belonged to it, stories he had dismissed as folklore but was beginning to understand might contain more truth than he had ever imagined. Dawn broke across the Wyoming plains with the gentle persistence of watercolors bleeding across canvas, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that Marcus had watched from his bedroom window for over a decade. But this morning felt different, charged with possibilities he couldn't quite name. The house itself seemed to breathe differently, filled with the subtle sounds of life he'd forgotten could exist within these walls. Marcus dressed quietly in his usual work clothes, denim and flannel that had seen countless mornings just like this one, yet everything felt transformed by the presence of the sleeping family upstairs. As he made his way to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under his boots in a familiar rhythm, he caught the scent of something that stopped him in his tracks. Coffee, rich and dark, was already brewing. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, her silhouette framed against the morning light as she watched the sun climb over the distant mountains. She'd found one of his grandmother's old robes, a faded blue cotton that had hung unused in the hall closet for years, and seeing it worn again sent an unexpected pang through his chest. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, catching the early sunlight like spun copper, and when she turned at the sound of his footsteps, her smile was tentative but genuine. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing toward the coffee maker. I'm an early riser, and I wanted to do something useful. The children are still sleeping, and Luna is standing guard at their door like some kind of mystical sentinel. Marcus accepted the mug she offered him, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The coffee was perfect, stronger than he usually made it, but exactly what he needed this morning. How did you sleep? Better than I have in months, Sarah admitted, settling into the chair across from him at the kitchen table. It's amazing what actual safety feels like when you've been without it for so long. The children didn't have nightmares for the first time in weeks. Through the window, Marcus could see his small herd of cattle moving slowly across the pasture, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. It was a scene he'd witnessed thousands of times, but today it felt like he was seeing it through fresh eyes, imagining how it might look to someone who had been living without the certainty of shelter and sustenance. Tell me about the ranch, Sarah said, following his gaze across the rolling landscape. How long has it been in your family? Marcus found himself talking easily, sharing stories he rarely told anyone about his great-grandfather's decision to settle in this particular valley, about the harsh winters that had tested 3 generations of Reids, about the delicate balance between respecting the land and making a living from it. Sarah listened with the kind of attention that made him feel like his words mattered, asking questions that showed she understood the deeper connections between family and place and responsibility. It sounds like a good life, she said, when he finished describing his grandfather's philosophy about stewardship versus ownership. Complicated but good. What about you? Marcus asked, though he kept his voice carefully neutral, not wanting to push against the walls he could sense her maintaining. What kind of life were you living before? Sarah's expression grew distant, her hands wrapping around her coffee mug as if drawing warmth from more than just the ceramic. I was a teacher. 3rd grade, in a small school district outside Denver. I loved it, working with children who still believed the world was fundamentally good, helping them discover what they were capable of learning and becoming. What happened? I met David, she said simply, and Marcus heard volumes in those 3 words. He was charming and successful, and seemed to offer stability for me and the children. I thought I was being practical, choosing security over romance. I didn't realize until too late that what I thought was protection was actually a prison. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of small feet on the stairs announced the arrival of the triplets. They appeared in the kitchen doorway like a matched set of sleepy angels, their hair tousled and their eyes still heavy with dreams. Emma carried a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days, while Ethan and Elena flanked their sister like tiny bodyguards. Good morning, Mr. Marcus, Emma said solemnly, her formal greeting making Marcus smile despite the gravity of their situation. Just Marcus is fine, he replied, rising to pour milk for their cereal. How did everyone sleep? Luna slept right across our doorway, Elena reported, her voice carrying the wonder of a child who had spent the night under the protection of a legendary creature. She didn't move all night, not even when Ethan had to use the bathroom. She's still there, Ethan added, climbing onto one of the kitchen chairs, just watching and listening, like she's making sure nothing bad can get to us. As if summoned by their conversation, Luna appeared in the kitchen doorway, her massive frame filling the space as she surveyed the domestic scene before her. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the varied colors in her thick coat, revealing shades of silver and charcoal and cream that Marcus hadn't noticed in the artificial light of the previous evening. She was even more magnificent in daylight, a creature that seemed to embody the wild spirit of the mountains themselves. The wolf padded into the kitchen with fluid grace, pausing to touch her nose gently to each child's hand before settling herself in a spot where she could observe both the family and the approaches to the house. Her yellow eyes met Marcus's across the room, and again he felt that uncanny sense of being evaluated by an intelligence that operated according to rules he didn't understand. She's beautiful, Marcus said, meaning it completely. She's special, Emma corrected, her small hand stroking Luna's massive head. She told me in my dreams last night that this place has old magic, good magic that protects people who belong here. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. His grandfather had told similar stories about the ranch, about the particular way the land seemed to shelter those who respected it and belonged to it. He'd always assumed those tales were folklore, the kind of stories that grew up around any place that had been home to multiple generations. But looking at Luna, at the way she seemed perfectly at ease in his kitchen despite being a wild predator, he began to wonder if there were truths in those old stories that his rational mind had been too quick to dismiss. What kind of magic? Marcus found himself asking, though he felt foolish for entertaining a child's imagination. "The kind that brings lost things home," Emma replied with the matter-of-fact certainty that children possessed before the world taught them to doubt their instincts. "Luna says this land remembers every person who ever loved it, and it calls to people who need the same kind of love." Sarah was watching her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern, clearly torn between encouraging Emma's imagination and protecting her from the potential disappointment that came with believing too strongly in magic. Marcus understood the dilemma. He'd spent his adult life dealing with practical realities, with the concrete challenges of maintaining equipment and managing livestock and balancing budgets. But there was something about Emma's quiet certainty, combined with Luna's inexplicable presence, that made him want to believe in possibilities beyond the merely practical. The morning routine that followed felt surprisingly natural, as if the ranch house had been waiting for exactly this kind of controlled chaos. The triplets took turns washing their faces in the downstairs bathroom, while Sarah helped Marcus prepare a breakfast that was more elaborate than anything he'd made for himself in years. Luna stationed herself by the kitchen window, her alert presence somehow making the ordinary activities feel both protected and significant. As they sat around the kitchen table sharing pancakes and bacon, Marcus found himself studying the faces of his unexpected guests. The children had lost the haunted quality he'd noticed the night before, their expressions more relaxed as they chattered about their dreams and made plans for exploring the ranch. Sarah still carried tension in her shoulders, but the lines around her eyes had softened, suggesting that even one night of genuine safety had begun to work its healing magic. "Can we see the horses today?" Ethan asked, his question directed at Marcus but his eyes seeking permission from his mother. "If your mama says it's okay," Marcus replied, understanding the complex dynamics that governed the family's interactions. "I've got a few gentle ones that might enjoy meeting some new friends." Sarah hesitated, and Marcus could see her wrestling with competing impulses. The desire to give her children normal experiences warred with the ingrained caution that had kept them alive during their flight from whatever danger they'd left behind. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "We could walk down to the barn after breakfast," Marcus suggested. "Nothing fancy, just introductions. Luna can come along if that would make everyone more comfortable." At the sound of her name, Luna raised her magnificent head and fixed Marcus with what he was beginning to recognize as her considering look. Then, to his continued amazement, she rose gracefully from her position by the window and padded over to where Emma sat. The wolf lowered her massive head until she was at eye level with the child, and for a long moment, they seemed to be engaged in some kind of silent communication. "Luna says the horses have been waiting for us," Emma announced, her voice carrying the same matter-of-fact certainty that had characterized all her pronouncements about the wolf's supposed opinions. "She says they know we're here, and they're curious about the children who travel with a wolf guardian." Marcus exchanged a glance with Sarah, seeing his own mixture of skepticism and wonder reflected in her expression. There was no denying that Luna's behavior was unlike anything he'd ever heard about wild wolves, and Emma's apparent ability to interpret the animal's intentions was moving beyond the realm of normal childhood imagination into something that defied rational explanation. The walk to the barn revealed the ranch in all its morning glory, the frost-covered grass crunching under their feet as they made their way across the yard. The mountains rose in the distance like ancient sentinels, their peaks touched with snow that promised the coming winter. Luna moved alongside them with the easy confidence of a creature perfectly at home in this landscape, her presence somehow making the ordinary scenery feel charged with significance. Marcus's horses were a mix of working stock and family pets, animals that had been chosen as much for their temperament as their utility. As they approached the fence line, 3 horses raised their heads with interest, their ears pricked forward as they took in the unusual sight of a timber wolf walking peacefully among humans. "This is Copper," Marcus said, indicating a rust-colored gelding who had ambled over to investigate the newcomers. "He's been with us for 12 years, and he's got the patience of a saint, perfect for kids who are just learning about horses." Emma stepped forward without hesitation, her small hand extended toward Copper's muzzle. The horse lowered his great head to sniff her palm, and Marcus held his breath, waiting for the moment when animal instinct would override curiosity, and the horse would shy away from the predator scent that must cling to the children. Instead, Copper nickered softly, and allowed Emma to stroke his neck, his eyes half closing with pleasure at the gentle touch. "He likes me," Emma said with satisfaction, then looked over at Luna, who was sitting calmly watching the interaction with apparent approval. "Luna says horses are good judges of character, and Copper thinks we're okay." Ethan and Alana approached more cautiously, their wonder evident as they experienced their first close encounter with such large animals. Marcus guided their small hands as they learned to pet Copper's neck and shoulder, showing them how to read the horse's body language and respect his size and strength. Sarah watched from a few steps away, her expression soft with the kind of joy that came from seeing her children experience something purely good. "They're natural with him," Marcus observed, genuinely impressed by how quickly the triplets had adapted to Copper's presence. "Some people are just born with an understanding of animals, Emma especially," Sarah agreed. Even as a baby she could calm upset animals just by being near them. Veterinarians used to comment on it, how creatures that were normally anxious or aggressive would settle down when she was in the room. As if to demonstrate the point, Luna rose from her seated position and padded over to the fence line. Copper, who should have been terrified by the proximity of a natural predator, instead stretched his neck over the fence rails and gently touched his muzzle to Luna's forehead. The wolf accepted the greeting with dignity, and for a moment, the two animals stood connected in a way that transcended the normal boundaries between species. "That's impossible," Marcus murmured, though he was watching it happen with his own eyes. "Luna doesn't believe in impossible," Emma said seriously. "She says the world is full of magic that people forget to notice because they're too busy being afraid of things that might happen instead of paying attention to things that are happening." The morning continued with a tour of the barn and equipment sheds, Marcus explaining the various aspects of ranch life while the children absorbed everything with the intensity of students encountering a fascinating new subject. Luna accompanied them throughout, her presence somehow making even the most mundane activities feel special. The triplets asked endless questions about cattle and horses, about the seasons and weather patterns, about the daily routines that kept the ranch functioning. "Do you ever get lonely?" Elena asked as they stood in the hayloft, looking out over the valley through the large doors that were used for moving bales. The question caught Marcus off guard with its directness and insight. He looked down at the little girl, seeing genuine curiosity in her eyes rather than pity or judgment. "Sometimes," he admitted, "especially in the evenings when the work is done and the house is quiet. Mama gets lonely too," Elena said matter-of-factly. "Even when we're all together, sometimes she gets sad about being by herself. But Luna says loneliness is just love that doesn't have anywhere to go yet." Once again Marcus felt that chill of recognition, as if Emma's supposed conversations with Luna were revealing truths he'd been avoiding. He told himself that his solitary life was a choice, a practical response to the demands of running the ranch and the lessons he'd learned about the cost of letting people too close. But maybe loneliness was exactly what Elena had described, love that had nowhere to go. They returned to the house for lunch, the children chattering excitedly about their morning adventure while Sarah helped Marcus prepare sandwiches and soup. The domestic routine felt increasingly natural, as if his kitchen had been designed for exactly this kind of family activity. Luna took up her position by the window again, but Marcus noticed that she seemed more relaxed now, her vigilant watch less intense than it had been earlier. "She's settling in," Sarah observed, following his gaze to the magnificent wolf. "Last night she was on high alert, ready to run or fight at the first sign of trouble. Now she looks almost content. What do you think that means?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about Sarah's interpretation of the wolf's behavior. "I think it means she believes we're truly safe here," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a note of wonder. "And if Luna believes it, then maybe I can start believing it too." The afternoon brought unexpected visitors in the form of Marcus's nearest neighbors, Tom and Betty Hutchinson, whose ranch adjoined his property on the eastern boundary. Marcus saw their truck coming up the long driveway and felt a moment of panic, uncertain how to explain the presence of a woman and 3 children and a timber wolf who seemed to have adopted his kitchen as her preferred territory. "Company," he announced, moving to look out the front window as the Hutchinsons parked their truck in the circular drive. Sarah's face immediately went pale, all the relaxation of the morning draining away as fear reasserted itself. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice tight with apprehension. "My neighbors," Marcus assured her quickly. "Good people, been friends of my family for 40 years, but maybe it would be better if Luna stayed inside while they're here. Might be hard to explain a timber wolf making herself at home in my living room." Emma looked up from the book she'd been reading, her expression serious. "Luna says she'll stay hidden, but she won't go far. She says strangers still need to be watched carefully." The triplets followed Luna upstairs while Marcus went out to greet his visitors, leaving Sarah to hover anxiously by the kitchen window. Tom Hutchinson was a man of few words who'd been working cattle in this valley for over 60 years, while his wife Betty had a reputation for knowing everyone's business within a 50-mile radius. They were exactly the kind of people who would notice unusual activity and draw their own conclusions about what it might mean. "Marcus," Tom said by way of greeting, his weathered face creased with the kind of concern that spoke of genuine friendship. "Betty saw smoke from your chimney yesterday evening, more than usual for this time of year. Wanted to make sure everything was all right." "Everything's fine," Marcus replied, hoping his voice sounded more casual than he felt. "Had some unexpected guests arrive during that storm we had. Travelers who needed a place to wait out the weather." Betty's sharp eyes were already scanning the ranch yard, taking in details that Marcus hoped wouldn't reveal too much about his current situation. "Guests," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Anyone we might know?" "Don't think so," Marcus said, fighting the urge to elaborate. His grandfather had taught him that the best lies were mostly truth, with just enough omission to protect what needed protecting. "Family with young children, got caught in the cold. You know how dangerous these November nights can be." "Indeed we do," Betty agreed, though Marcus could see her cataloging inconsistencies, probably noting that there were no additional vehicles visible and wondering how a family with young children had ended up on foot in the middle of nowhere. "Are they still here?" Before Marcus could answer, Emma appeared around the corner of the house, her small figure bundled in one of his old ranch coats that hung nearly to her ankles. She moved with the careful dignity of a child who had learned to navigate adult conversations, and Marcus felt his heart skip as he realized their careful deception was about to become much more complicated. "Hello," Emma said politely, approaching the group with the kind of fearless curiosity that characterized all her interactions with the world. "I'm Emma, are you friends of Marcus?" Betty Hutchinson's expression immediately softened, the way adults' faces always changed when confronted with a genuinely charming child. "Well, hello there, sweetheart. I'm Mrs. Hutchinson, and this is my husband Tom. We live on the ranch next door." "It's very beautiful here," Emma said seriously. "Luna says this valley has been protected by good people for a long time, and that's why it feels so safe." Marcus held his breath, waiting for the inevitable questions about who Luna might be. But before either of the Hutchinsons could ask for clarification, Ethan and Elena appeared, flanking their sister like a matched set of small diplomats. The sight of three identical children, clearly well cared for despite their obviously second-hand clothing, seemed to satisfy some of Betty's unspoken questions about the nature of Marcus's guests. "Triplets," Betty said with obvious delight. "How wonderful, and how old are you?" "4," Elena replied solemnly. "But Emma's the oldest by 7 minutes, so she's in charge when Mama's not around." "And where is your mama?" Tom asked gently, his question directed at the children, but clearly intended for Marcus's benefit. "She's in the kitchen," Ethan replied. "She's helping Marcus make cookies because we've never had a kitchen big enough for baking before." The innocent revelation hung in the air, providing both more information than Marcus had intended to share, and raising new questions about the family's circumstances. Betty's expression grew thoughtful, the way it did when she was processing information and drawing conclusions that she would keep to herself until she decided what, if anything, needed to be done about them. "Well," Betty said finally, "I hope you're all staying warm enough. This old house can be drafty when the weather turns cold." "It's the warmest place we've ever lived," Emma said with the devastating honesty that only children possessed. "And Luna says the house is happy to have a family in it again, because houses need people to take care of them just like people need houses to take care of them." Marcus saw recognition flicker across Tom's weathered features, the kind of understanding that came from a lifetime of listening to the land and the creatures that inhabited it. The old rancher looked at Marcus with new interest, as if seeing him in a different light. "Luna sounds like a wise friend," Tom said carefully. "Is she here with you?" The triplets exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that Marcus was learning characterized their interactions when adult conversations touched on subjects they weren't sure how to navigate. Finally Emma nodded toward the house. "She's watching from inside," Emma said. "She doesn't like to meet new people until she's sure they're safe for us to know." "That sounds very sensible," Betty said, though Marcus could see her trying to piece together the puzzle of a family traveling with someone named Luna who apparently had strong opinions about stranger safety. Perhaps we'll meet her another time, when she feels more comfortable. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, the Hutchinsons extracting information through gentle questions and careful observation, while the triplets answered with the kind of innocent honesty that revealed both more and less than Marcus would have preferred. By the time his neighbors prepared to leave, Marcus was certain they understood that he was sheltering a family in some kind of distress, though the specific nature of that distress remained mercifully unclear. "Marcus," Tom said quietly, as they walked toward the truck, speaking low enough that the children couldn't overhear. "If you need anything, anything at all, you call us. Some things are more important than minding your own business, and if anyone comes around asking questions about strangers in the area," Betty added, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades managing information flow in a small community, "well, we haven't seen anything unusual, have we, Tom?" Tom's gruff nod was all the confirmation Marcus needed that the Hutchinsons had appointed themselves unofficial guardians of whatever secret he was harboring. The knowledge was both comforting and terrifying, representing the kind of community support that could make all the difference while also acknowledging that their situation was precarious enough to require such protection. As the truck disappeared down the long driveway, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling more heavily on his shoulders. The Hutchinsons' visit had driven home the reality that harboring Sarah and her children wasn't a temporary inconvenience, but a commitment that could have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Whatever dangers the family was fleeing were real enough that even his neighbors could sense the undercurrents of their situation. Sarah met him at the kitchen door, her face pale with anxiety. "What did you tell them?" "The truth mostly," Marcus replied. "That you needed shelter from the storm, and somewhere safe to stay." They didn't ask too many specific questions, but Betty Hutchinson has a reputation for putting pieces together even when people try to keep them separate. "Do you think they'll tell anyone?" Marcus considered the question seriously, remembering Tom's quiet offer of support and Betty's deliberate assurance about not having seen anything unusual. "No," he said finally. "I think they'll do exactly the opposite. The Hutchinsons have been part of this community for decades, and they understand that sometimes people need help without a lot of questions being asked." Luna appeared at the top of the stairs, her massive form silhouetted against the afternoon light streaming through the hallway window. She descended with fluid grace, pausing to greet each of the children before taking up her position by the kitchen window. Her yellow eyes found Marcus across the room, and again he felt that sense of being evaluated by an intelligence that operated according to principles he was only beginning to understand. "She was watching," Emma reported, settling onto the floor beside Luna's massive form. "She says your neighbors are good people with kind hearts, but she also says there are others coming who aren't good at all." The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop several degrees, and Marcus felt ice forming in his stomach. "Others?" Emma's small hand stroked Luna's thick fur, and the wolf's tail gave a single deliberate thump against the hardwood floor. "She says the bad man is getting closer, and he's bringing helpers who know how to find people who don't want to be found. But she also says we don't have to run anymore, because this place will protect us if we're brave enough to let it." Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, her face draining of color as fear reasserted its grip on her features. "David's found us," she whispered. "I knew this peace was too good to last. We have to leave, Marcus, tonight before he gets here and puts you in danger too." But even as she spoke the words, Marcus found himself shaking his head, a certainty rising in his chest that surprised him with its intensity. "No," he said quietly, "you're not running anymore. Not from here." Luna raised her magnificent head and fixed him with those intelligent yellow eyes, and Marcus could have sworn he saw approval in their golden depths. Then, as if to underscore his decision, the timber wolf tilted back her head and released one of those impossibly soft howls, a sound that seemed to carry promises and possibilities, and the kind of magic that his grandfather had always insisted lived in the bones of the land itself. The sound echoed through the old ranch house like a declaration of war, like a promise of protection, like the voice of the mountains themselves rising to shelter those who had found their way home. And in that moment, Marcus understood that whatever came next, whatever storm was bearing down on their small sanctuary, they would face it together on ground that had been chosen as much as they had chosen it. The battle for Sarah and her children's freedom was about to begin, but it would be fought on Marcus Reid's territory, under the protection of forces older and wilder than anything their pursuers could bring to bear. Luna's soft howl had announced their intention to stand and fight, and the land itself seemed to be listening, preparing to lend its ancient strength to the defense of those who truly belonged. The black SUV appeared on the horizon 3 days later, cutting through the morning stillness like a predator stalking prey across the Wyoming landscape. Marcus spotted it first through the kitchen window, the vehicle moving slowly along the county road that bordered his property, too deliberate in its pace to be casual traffic. Luna raised her magnificent head from where she lay beside the triplets, who were coloring at the kitchen table, and released a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards themselves. "He's here," Sarah whispered, her coffee mug frozen halfway to her lips as she followed Marcus's gaze to the distant road. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking fragile and haunted in a way that made Marcus's chest tighten with protective anger. Emma looked up from her drawing, her crayon still clutched in her small fist. "Luna says the bad man brought 3 helpers, and they think they're very clever because they have technology and money. But she also says they don't understand the rules that govern this place." The SUV made a second pass 20 minutes later, this time stopping at the main gate that marked the entrance to Broken Arrow Ranch. Through his grandfather's old binoculars, Marcus could see 4 men inside the vehicle, their expensive clothes and calculated movements marking them as professionals rather than local law enforcement. These weren't people who had stumbled upon the ranch by accident. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she gathered Elena closer to her side. The other triplets had abandoned their coloring, sensing the tension that had suddenly filled the room like smoke from a dangerous fire. "We handle it," Marcus replied, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "This is private property, and they have no right to be here without permission or a warrant." "Luna, what do you think?" The timber wolf had positioned herself between the children and the window, her massive body coiled with barely contained energy. At the sound of her name, she turned those intelligent yellow eyes toward Marcus, and he felt the same uncanny sensation of communication that had characterized all their interactions. Then Luna padded to the kitchen door and released another of her soft howls, this one carrying a different tone than any Marcus had heard before. "She's calling for help," Emma said matter-of-factly, as if interpreting the communication of timber wolves was the most natural thing in the world. "She says the land remembers how to protect its own, and that we just need to trust in something bigger than ourselves." Before Marcus could ask what that meant, the answer began to reveal itself. The first to arrive was Tom Hutchinson's old pickup truck, followed closely by the battered sedan that belonged to Jake Morrison, whose family had worked cattle in the valley for 5 generations. Within 15 minutes 7 vehicles had assembled in Marcus's ranch yard, their occupants emerging with the kind of quiet determination that spoke of community bonds forged across generations of mutual dependence. "Figured you might need some company," Tom said simply, his weathered hands resting on the shotgun he carried with casual familiarity. "Betty spotted that fancy SUV making circles around the neighborhood, and we thought it might be neighborly to drop by for a visit." The assembled group represented the informal network of families who had sustained each other through decades of economic uncertainty and natural disasters. They were people who understood that sometimes questions weren't necessary, that some situations called for solidarity rather than explanation. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat as he realized that his community had quietly mobilized to protect something they valued, even without fully understanding what was at stake. The confrontation came exactly at noon, when the SUV finally drove through the ranch gate and approached the house with the arrogant confidence of people accustomed to getting their way through intimidation and superior resources. 4 men emerged from the vehicle, their expensive suits and calculated movements immediately marking them as outsiders in a landscape where function mattered more than fashion. The man who stepped forward first was tall and lean, with the kind of practiced charm that Marcus immediately distrusted. His smile was professionally warm, but his eyes remained cold as they catalogued the assembled group of ranchers and their various weapons with obvious calculation. "Good afternoon," the man said, his voice carrying the polished tones of someone accustomed to boardrooms and courtrooms. "I'm Detective Reynolds with the Denver Police Department. We're looking for a woman named Sarah Colton and her 3 children. We have reason to believe they may be in this area." Marcus stepped forward, acutely aware of the community members flanking him and the weight of their collective support. "This is private property, Detective. Do you have a warrant?" Reynolds' smile tightened slightly, the first crack in his professional facade. "We're simply conducting a welfare check, Mr. Reid. Mrs. Colton's husband is concerned about his wife's mental state and the safety of his children. I'm sure you understand the importance of family unity." "I understand the importance of protecting people who need protection," Marcus replied evenly. "And I don't see any badges or identification that would give you authority to conduct searches on my property." The detective reached into his jacket pocket, and Marcus felt the tension ratchet up another notch as several of his neighbors shifted their positions slightly, but instead of a weapon, Reynolds produced a leather wallet containing what appeared to be legitimate police credentials. The sight of them sent ice through Marcus's veins, because official law enforcement changed the dynamics of their situation in ways he wasn't prepared to handle. "Now then," Reynolds continued, his confidence restored by the production of his badge, "I'm sure we can handle this situation civilly. We simply need to speak with Mrs. Colton and verify that she and the children are safe. Once we've confirmed their welfare, we can discuss the best way to reunite this family." Sarah appeared in the doorway of the ranch house, her chin raised in defiance despite the fear Marcus could see in her eyes. She dressed carefully for this confrontation, her appearance neat and composed in a way that spoke of preparation rather than panic. The triplets flanked her, their small hands linked together as they faced the strangers who represented everything they'd been running from. "I'm Sarah Colton," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the ranch yard with surprising strength. "And I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my welfare and that of my children." Reynolds' professional mask slipped slightly as he took in the sight of the woman and children he'd been hired to retrieve. Whatever he'd been told about Sarah's supposed instability clearly didn't match the composed, determined person standing before him. The triplets showed no signs of neglect or abuse, their clean clothes and healthy appearance contradicting any narrative about an unfit mother. "Mrs. Colton," Reynolds said, his tone shifting to something that might have been intended as paternal concern, "your husband is very worried about you. He's told us about your recent struggles with depression and anxiety, and he's concerned that you may not be thinking clearly about what's best for the children." "My ex-husband," Sarah corrected firmly, "is the reason we left Denver. And these children are safer here than they've ever been in their lives." At that moment Luna emerged from the house, her massive form filling the doorway as she surveyed the scene before her. The four men from the SUV took an involuntary step backward, their urban confidence wavering in the face of a predator that belonged to the wild landscape rather than the controlled environments they were accustomed to navigating. "Jesus Christ," one of Reynolds' companions muttered, his hand moving instinctively toward what Marcus assumed was a concealed weapon. "Is that a wolf, timber wolf?" Jake Morrison said helpfully, his tone suggesting he was discussing the weather rather than a 120-pound predator. "They're protected in this state, you know. Federal offense to harm one without proper permits." Luna descended the porch steps with fluid grace, positioning herself between the children and the strangers, her yellow eyes fixed on Reynolds with an intensity that made the detective visibly uncomfortable, and Marcus could see sweat beading on the man's forehead despite the cool November air. "She's beautiful," Emma said proudly, her small hand resting on Luna's massive head. "And she doesn't like you very much. She says you smell like lies and fear and something else that's rotten inside." Reynolds looked increasingly unsettled by the child's matter-of-fact assessment, his professional composure cracking further as he tried to process a situation that clearly fell outside his normal parameters. City training hadn't prepared for dealing with armed ranchers, protective communities, and children who claimed to communicate with timber wolves. "Look," Reynolds said, his patience clearly we can do this the easy way or the hard way. I have legal authority to take these children into protective custody if I believe they're in an unsafe environment. A wild animal living in the house certainly qualifies as unsafe." "Luna doesn't live in the house," Alina corrected solemnly, "she lives everywhere. In the house and the barn and the mountains and the wind. She says this whole valley is her territory, and we're under her protection now." The detective's face was growing redder with each exchange, his urban sensibilities clearly overwhelmed by the mystical elements that the children treated as simple facts. Marcus could see the man's frustration mounting as his attempts to assert authority met with calm resistance backed by community solidarity and supernatural guardianship that defied his understanding of how these situations were supposed to unfold. "That's enough," Reynolds snapped, abandoning his professional demeanor entirely. "Children, you're coming with us." Your father has legal custody, and I have a court order authorizing us to take you into protective custody pending resolution of this matter. As the detective stepped forward, several things happened simultaneously. Luna released a sound that was part growl and part roar, a wild call that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. The assembled ranchers shifted their positions, forming a loose circle around the family they'd come to protect, and from the ridgeline above the ranch, answering howls began to rise in response to Luna's call. "What the hell is that?" one of Reynolds's men asked, his voice tight with fear as the haunting sounds multiplied and echoed across the valley. "Pack," Tom Hutchinson said simply, though his eyes were wide with wonder as he scanned the surrounding hills. "Sounds like Luna's got family in the earth." Marcus felt his heart pounding as he realized the implications of what was happening. The howls were coming from multiple directions, suggesting that Luna's presence at the ranch had attracted other wolves to the area. Whether they were actual family members, or simply other wolves responding to her calls, the message was clear: the children under Luna's protection had just gained guardianship from the entire local wolf population. Reynolds was backing toward his SUV, his professional confidence completely shattered by developments that fell so far outside his experience that he had no framework for processing them. "This is insane," he muttered, pulling out his cell phone. "I'm calling for backup." "Might want to check your signal strength first," Betty Hutchinson called from where she stood beside her husband. "Cell service can be pretty spotty out here, especially when the weather's changing." Indeed, the detective's attempts to place his call were clearly unsuccessful, his frustration mounting as he held his phone in various positions trying to find a signal that had been perfectly reliable just an hour earlier. Marcus had lived in the valley long enough to know that technology sometimes failed in ways that couldn't be easily explained, particularly when the mountains themselves seemed to be taking sides in human conflicts. "You can't keep us here," Reynolds said, his voice rising with panic as he realized that his position of authority had evaporated along with his communication capabilities. "We're law enforcement officers, and we have a job to do." "Then do it legally," Marcus replied calmly. "Bring a proper warrant, follow due process, and maybe we can have a conversation. But right now, you're trespassing on private property and threatening to kidnap children without proper legal justification." Sarah stepped forward, her fear replaced by a determination that seemed to draw strength from the community surrounding her, and the mystical protection that Luna represented. "Detective Reynolds, I am voluntarily remaining here with my children. They are safe, healthy, and happy. If my ex-husband wants to pursue legal custody, he can do so through proper channels, with full disclosure of the domestic violence that prompted our departure from Denver." "You can't prove any abuse," Reynolds blustered, though his certainty was clearly wavering. "Actually, I can," Sarah replied quietly. "I have photographs, medical records, and witness statements that I was too frightened to file before, but I'm not frightened anymore. This place, these people, and Luna have taught me that some things are worth fighting for." Luna raised her magnificent head, and released another of her soft howls, and this time the answering calls from the surrounding hills seemed to create a symphony of wild voices that spoke of ancient alliances and protection that ran deeper than human laws or urban authority. Reynolds and his companions were clearly outmatched by forces they didn't understand, their expensive suits and professional credentials meaning nothing in a landscape governed by older, wilder rules. "This isn't over," Reynolds said, though his threat sounded hollow as he and his men retreated toward their SUV. "We'll be back with proper warrants and additional personnel." "You do that," Tom Hutchinson replied easily. "Course might take some time to get warrants processed properly. Paperwork has a way of getting delayed when it's not filed correctly the first time, and winter's coming early this year. Roads can get pretty treacherous for folks who don't know the area." As the SUV disappeared down the ranch road, the assembled community members began to disperse, their quiet solidarity having accomplished exactly what it was intended to accomplish. They offered no explanations and asked for none, understanding that some situations required action rather than discussion. Marcus felt a profound gratitude for these people who had rallied to protect something they valued without needing to fully understand all the details. The wolf howls gradually faded as the immediate threat disappeared, but Luna remained alert, her massive form positioned protectively between the family and the direction the SUV had taken. The triplets seemed remarkably unaffected by the confrontation, their resilience suggesting they had faced worse situations and emerged stronger for the experience. "Is it really over?" Sarah asked, though her question seemed directed more at Luna than at Marcus. Emma looked up at her mother with the kind of ancient wisdom that sometimes emerged from children who had been forced to grow up too quickly. Luna says the bad man won't come back. She says the land has chosen us, and that means we belong here now. But she also says we have to choose the land back, which means we can't keep running from the life we want to live. Marcus looked at Sarah, seeing the fear and hope warring in her expression, understanding that the choice Emma had described wasn't just about geography but about the courage to believe in something better than survival. There's plenty of room here for a family, he said quietly. If you want to stay, if you want to build something permanent, then this place can be home for as long as you want it to be. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time since he'd known her, they seemed to be tears of relief rather than fear. The children have never had a real home, she whispered, somewhere they could put down roots and feel safe and know they wouldn't have to leave. Then they have one now, Marcus replied, meaning it completely. We all do. Luna raised her head and released one final howl, this one carrying the soft, gentle tone that had marked all her communications of approval and acceptance. The sound seemed to bless the decision that had just been made, to consecrate the transformation of Marcus's solitary ranch into something larger and more meaningful than he could have imagined. As the sun set over the Wyoming mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that spoke of endings and beginnings, the small family that had found each other through circumstances beyond their control settled into the rhythm of their new life. Luna took up her position on the porch, her yellow eyes scanning the horizon with the vigilance of a guardian who understood that protection was an ongoing responsibility rather than a single act of heroism. Spring came early that year, bringing with it the legal resolution of Sarah's custody battle and the final dissolution of her marriage to a man who had never understood that love couldn't be owned or controlled. The ranch flourished under the care of people who belonged to it as much as it belonged to them, and the triplets grew strong and confident in the knowledge that they had found the one thing every child needed most, a place where they were unconditionally wanted and absolutely safe. Luna remained with them, a mystical guardian whose presence reminded them daily that some kinds of magic couldn't be explained, only experienced and treasured. She aged gracefully alongside the children she protected, her wild wisdom serving as a bridge between the human world and the ancient forces that governed the land itself. Years later, when the triplets had children of their own and the Broken Arrow Ranch had become legendary in the valley for the way it seemed to attract people who needed healing and protection, Marcus would sometimes sit on the porch in the evenings and remember that first stormy night when his carefully ordered life had been transformed by the arrival of strangers who weren't strangers at all, but family he hadn't known he was waiting for. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, and the mountains seemed to whisper secrets that only the land itself could know, he would hear the echo of Luna's soft howl carried on the breeze, a reminder that some bonds transcended the boundaries between species and seasons and the rational limitations of what city people thought was possible. The magic was real, had always been real, and would continue to protect those wise enough to recognize it and brave enough to trust in the ancient wisdom that flowed through the bones of the earth itself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.